English and medieval literature, and was working with that, and that was a sort of a favorite spot for me.
Mine too. Paul, you have had quite a connection to Westminster College. It goes way back, quite a history. Can you tell us a little bit about the beginning, the inception of Westminster College and your connection to it?
It's a little hard to put a starting time on it, really, because as a child I became aware of Westminster College as sort of a presence in our home. My grandmother was a graduate of the first regular graduating class. My father and his brother and sister were all Westminster graduates, and I would hear them talking about Westminster College, so I just became gradually aware of Westminster College. And as I got a little older, I became a little better understanding of what it was and what it meant to our family. I remember very well my first personal visit to the college. I was 10 years old. My father was coming back for his 25-year reunion, and he decided it was high time for me to see Westminster College. Well, I must confess I was a little bit disappointed because I had built up all sorts of fancy expectations. In the first place, the old Sharpie Railroad. Have you ever heard of the old Sharpie Railroad?
No, I haven't.
Well, this was a railroad line that ran from Wilmington Junction up right through New Wilmington up to Sharpsville. And they called it the Sharpie because it went to Sharpsville. And students, it was a very popular butt of student jokes. You know, they would talk about the train breaking down. They'd have to stop and get a cow off the railroad track. And they would talk about the old lady that was in a hurry, so she got off and went on ahead. So I was expecting something special from the ride on the Sharpie, and it turned out to be pretty much like other trains, maybe a little dingy, but pretty much like any other train. I'd been reading college stories, college books about college adventures and athletics and so on. And I got down here, and it just seemed, the students seemed to be like young ladies, young men just walking calmly around campus. Nobody having tug-of-wars or... So my first visit was a little disillusioning, but well.
Your grandfather was great-grandfather was William Dickey.
Yes.
Can you tell us a little bit
yes,
about him?
Yes, my great-grandfather was one of the founders of the college. There were three men in particular who seemed to have a sort of a dream of having a college for the Associate Presbyterian Church. And he was one of them. The other two were ministers who comprised the first faculty, the two men who were the first faculty. My grandfather had trained for the ministry but gone into other activities, as we heard, because he thought his voice was not suited for pulpit work. But he became the financial agent when the college was started, which was sort of a combination of the business manager and the development fundraiser and so on. And he rode around western Pennsylvania on horseback, raising money to build the first college building. And when the building was only 6 years old, it burned to the ground. And it was quite a blow to him. He suffered a stroke shortly after that, and I think was dead inside of 6 months. But so that's where the connection starts with my great-grandfather.
This was the first Old Main?
No, it was the predecessor of Old Main. It never got to be Old Main because it burned when it was only 6 years old.
That's right.
Now, the second main building, it was erected it was on the same site as Old Main Memorial. But the second building, which, as I recall, was finished in 1862 and lasted until 1927, it became known as Old Main. And for a good many years, it was the college. They called it the college because that was it. But Then Old Main Memorial, the present Old Main building, was, I think, finished in 1929. And it's the third one.
And your grandmother was one of the first women to graduate from Westminster.
Yes. We had our first commencement was in 1856. It included 5 men, 3 of whom were transfer students. They had done some of their work elsewhere. Mm-hmm. The next year, and this was 1857, we had what I usually refer to as the first regular or first full graduating class, because we had 21 in that class. 10 of them were women, and almost all of them had done all of their college work here at Westminster, the new college.
Was that unheard of for the time, to have a class with so many women?
Yes, it was. Westminster's main claim to fame historically is that Westminster was a significant pioneer in coeducation. When it opened its doors, and this was for a short term in April of 1852, something happened that had never happened before, and that was that men and women were admitted to a coeducational college on exactly the same basis as men, with all the courses open to them on the same basis. Even the same rules applied to men and women at that time. It was remarkable for its day, really. And
there were no colleges in the country doing this at the time then?
Oberlin College is usually credited with being the first college in coeducation, and I think this is proper, because this is where the main barrier was broken down, and women came over to the men's college, took courses, and graduated with a regular A.B. degree, which I believe are probably the first bona fide A.B. degrees granted to women. But Oberlin College was not founded as a coeducational college. It was founded as a men's college with a women's companion seminary connected with it. From the beginning, in the women's school, in their senior year, they were permitted to take some courses over in the men's college. But it was never envisioned they would get college degrees. But there were 4 very determined women who kept after it in spite of the objections of the faculty and the board of trustees of the women's college. They had a separate board and so on. They broke down the barrier. They earned their degrees and received their degrees in 1841, I believe it was 41 or 42. But segregation and discrimination was very strong over there. The women who completed their degrees were required to write commencement essays, but they were not permitted to deliver them at the commencement exercises. They had to be read by a man because they thought it was not proper for a woman to make an address in mixed company. Now, that's the kind of discrimination that was still going on. But these women broke down the main barrier. They got their A.B. degrees. But what happened at Westminster had never happened before. We started as a coeducational college with equal opportunities as far as admission, classes, graduation, everything was concerned. That was new. That had not been done before.
So your grandmother was graduated with a degree in the classics, as I think I read in your book.
Well, I tell you, there was, we started with 2 different courses of instruction. And one of them was the typical classical curriculum of the day, which means that over half of the courses were in ancient languages, Greek, Latin, and Hebrew. There was a demand for more practical I perhaps should put this in quotes, but I don't know if it needs to be in quotes because I think it really was more practical. A course of instruction. This was designed particularly to be helpful to women who wanted to be school teachers. There was a growing demand for women school teachers. That was a man's occupation before, but school boards were discovering that they could get women to teach school, and they could probably do as good or a better job than the men, and they would only have to pay them about half as much. So there was a demand for women's teachers, and my grandmother took the English or scientific course and became a school teacher. But Sarah McMichael, who was a cousin of my grandfather on the other side of the family, was the first woman to earn a regular BA degree with taking a regular classical course. She later returned to Westminster, was on the Westminster faculty for a time until she got married and dropped out of the teaching field. But and they were classmates. Of course, they were not related in any way until my father married my mother a long time later. But
did both your parents attend Westminster?
no. My mother went to Slippery Rock, and at that time it was a state normal school, and it was in the business of preparing teachers.
Was your father went to Westminster? That's
Oh yes,
right?
yes. My
and
father
he served
and his
on the
brother
board
and
of
sister.
trustees.
Yes. It's been very much family college. My brother and sister preceded me at Westminster, and my cousins, who were the children of my aunt and uncle, attended Westminster. So it was, practically unbroken college. I mean, we were all Westminster people until the next generation. But all three of my children and all three of their spouses attended Westminster. And I was fourth generation, counting my great-grandfather. And my children were fifth generation. And I did have one grandson that graduated from Westminster, and he was sixth generation. But the other grandchildren have gone elsewhere.
So let me guess what the topic of conversation was in your house.
Well, I think that I talked about Westminster enough that my wife got tired hearing about it sometimes. So I tried to not to talk about Westminster College too much.
What's it like growing up with all of your relatives and the connection you have with Westminster? What must that have been like?
Well, I don't know what to compare it to, really. It's a hard question to answer. I decided when I was in high school that I wanted to go to Yale. And my father seemed to be amenable to the idea. But he approached me and he said, what would you think of starting at Westminster and transferring to Yale after the first or second year? This was something that was done very commonly in those days. The idea was that it was better for college students to start out in a smaller college rather than going into a university. And so a lot of them started out and took very often the first 2 years in college and then transferred to a big university or a prestigious university and so on. Well, I got involved in things at Westminster, particularly two very favorite professors who started at Westminster the same year I started. One of them was Al Cordray, who was really the father of drama at Westminster. And I had a weakness for drama. And he had one or two new courses in drama added to the curriculum each year, and I would be standing in line to sign up. And I was very active in the theater, both on stage and backstage and so on. Also, Ben Uema, who was a fine literature professor, very good. he went on, wasn't here too long, he went on to Penn State and became eventually the dean of the College of Arts and Science at Penn State. So there were things that really were attracting me to stay at Westminster. And it occurred to me that I would save enough money by finishing at Westminster that I could afford, on the same amount of money, a year of graduate school to get my master's degree. So that's what happened to Yale. They never got me. Because by the time I graduated from Westminster, I'd become more interested in anything else than playwriting. And the number one school, graduate school for playwriting at that time was University of North Carolina. Paul Green was there. And I decided I would like to go to University of North Carolina and work especially in playwriting and so on.
So you picked up your master's at North Carolina?
Now, maybe we're getting a little far afield from Westminster here.
I'm interested in your background.
Well,
too.
as far as my background is concerned, I had a problem with my nerves. And the doctor down there advised me to get away from the books for a while. He said, go home and get a job in the mill or something where you're just too much tied up in the books and so on. Well, it was the middle of the Depression. You couldn't get a job anyplace. Mm-hmm. And, well, the end of the story, as far as that's concerned, is I never got back to graduate school, so I started taking graduate courses at Westminster. And it just seemed like coming home. And I thought, well, you know, I don't belong in administration. I belong in the classroom. And I went on for further graduate work at Pitt. So that's my story.
So what was your tenure here? How many years did you teach for Westminster?
I started teaching radio courses part-time. I was in the radio business for, I guess, about 10 or 11 years. And I was teaching radio and speech courses. And then I was drafted into, I started on the college faculty in 1946. I started in full-time in administration as alumni secretary in 1949. And I was in administration for 16 years. 11 years as alumni secretary, 5 years as the assistant to the president for development. The job, I was the first one to hold the job, which is now vice president for development. And after 16 years of that, meanwhile, I'd started taking my graduate courses, and I thought, well, what I really want is to get back in the classroom. If there's some way I can get back in there, and so I did. The last 12 years, well, I guess 46 to 94, 95 is very close to 50 years. The thing that I really enjoyed the most was my 12 years in the English department before I retired. That was a frosting on the cake. I really loved that. I like teaching. I like working with students. So,
let's go back to the Patterson years, the first administration at Westminster. Wasn't without its difficulties. What were some of the challenges that Patterson faced as president of this college?
You know, they were, when you think about them, the college started on a shoestring financially. So for a good many years, trying to make ends meet was a major problem. Well, in addition to that, Patterson encountered the Civil War, which was not as much a problem as I found as you might expect it to be. Not as much of a problem really as World War I or II as far as taking students away from the campus and so on. But it was a disruptive thing. The fire, which actually occurred before the Civil War, was a real blow because the college was, they'd had a real hard time scraping together the money to build that building. And colleges were founded. They lasted a few years. They lasted 15, 20 years. They folded up. Some of them kept going. Westminster was one that kept going. But it was a time when a lot of colleges were started around the mid-1800s, and a lot of them didn't survive till 1900. So, this fire was a serious blow. I have no information about it, but I don't think it was too common to have things insured. And I think it probably meant just starting over again to raise more money and build the building. The students held a mass meeting after the fire, and they passed a resolution to pass it on to the board and to the faculty that Westminster still lives, the building's gone, but the college is still here. And my great-grandfather, somebody carried word about the fire to him. He was on a farm out towards Mercer, and he came over to the college to see the ruins. He had a daughter in college at the same time. My grandmother had graduated, but he had a younger daughter who was in college. He went over to her room, and she told him about the student meeting. And he said, "Tell me that again. That helps." And but as far as President Patterson was concerned, he did a heroic job for the college. He was considered a very able teacher. He could teach almost any subject, and he did on occasion. He filled in for various professors. Of course, for a good many years, the president was a teaching member of the faculty. And the end of the Patterson administration, when I got to study his administration, realizing what an important job he had done for the college, a heroic job, and I read about the way the administration ended, I was shocked, really. And I have spent, this would have been probably around 1950 when I was doing the research for the first history. And I have been working ever since to try to find out what happened, and I have never really found out. I have a pretty good idea, suppositions, but perhaps you could call them probabilities.
Can you tell us about some of those probabilities? The board just asked him to resign?
What happened was the board met in June. This would have been, let's see, he was here for 13 years, 54 to 67. They met in June and voted increases in salary for the president and the other professors, the other 3 professors, I guess it was at that time. I guess it was 4 plus the president. Obviously well satisfied the way things are going. In the fall, in September, in connection with the synod meeting where all the members of the Board of Trustees were there, they went into a special called session of the Board of Trustees, went into a committee of the whole for which there were no minutes, came out of the committee of the whole with a resolution requesting the resignation of the president and all the members of the faculty. Well, that was a real bomb, of course. Now, I know that some of the things that began to emerge in the administration that followed provided some clues. This was the first period, first of 3 periods, rather extended periods of disruption and so on in the college history. This was the first one. And that's how it started. the vice president of the board, Robert Audley Brown, who was a pastor in Newcastle, was elected president to take his place. He declined to take it, but they kept after him until he did take it. Now, he was here for 3 years. Every year he resigned. The first 2 years, his resignations were declined, and he stayed on. The third year, he resigned, and they accepted his resignation. But there was division in the faculty, disruption throughout that period. And I feel that what happened at Westminster was probably faculty and board politics. Now, when President Patterson resigned, the student body presented a petition with many signatures, probably most of the student body, requesting the board to reconsider. He was held in very high regard by the students. He went on to a career in the church. He was obviously highly regarded in the church. And what he could have done, I really don't know. Campus politics could have played a part in it, maybe played the major role. I don't know. That's about as much. But it was obvious. There was one of President Brown's resignations was withdrawn after, well, when he resigned, there were several other members of the faculty who resigned, along with Brown. When Brown was named president, Professor Vincent, George C. Vincent, who was probably the #1 leader among the founders, was named vice president. And apparently, Vincent and Brown could not get along. After Vincent resigned as vice president, Brown reconsidered and said he would stay on as president, and the other 2 faculty members who resigned, they reconsidered and they stayed on with Brown. Obviously, the Brown faction, and there was a Vincent faction too. I don't know whether I'm going into too much detail on this. Of course, you can cut some of this out.
Sure,
later, but
we'll
anyway,
edit.
Just within the last few years, I ran across a lot of letters that Robert Audley Brown wrote to his wife while he was serving as chaplain for the Roundhead Regiment. He wrote very regularly to his wife, and we have a wonderful collection of his letters as Civil War chaplain, but mixed in with those letters, I found 3 or 4 letters that were written to his wife while he was president of the college, when he was away from New Wilmington. This was a letter from Pittsburgh. He was down in Pittsburgh working on fundraising and cognacs down there, and he unburdened himself somewhat on the problems at the college. And the problems he was having with an incompetent old fogey who was not named in the letter, but the next board minutes made it obvious as to who the incompetent old fogey was. It was Vincent, because at the next board meeting, they have the minutes there, where the board met separately with Brown and with Vincent. And Vincent resigned as vice president and so on. But it was obviously that this was a sort of a showdown that was shaping up, what he was talking about in a letter. Now, he also said, and he wrote this in extra, which to me underlined it, the old fogey that is causing and has caused all these problems at Westminster which I figure could very well refer to the problems that developed for President Patterson. But you see, that is, I suppose, in a way, sort of grasping for straws, which I was doing in the case of trying to solve the Patterson mystery. But it's still basically a mystery. And
It does sound rather like he might have been referring to that era.
yeah, because I think the trouble started in the Patterson,
Right.
and it never ended until Brown was gone, and we got in our youngest president, who was an excellent scholar, did a lot for the college academically, and that evened things out, and that thing was over with. But it started in the end of the Patterson administration. It extended. We had a year without a president after Brown left. They probably had a hard time getting somebody to take the job, and I could understand why. But
Did we have an acting president?
nobody by that name. The first year, Vincent was the equivalent to the acting president. Then he left, and there was a Finley. I believe his name was William Finley, who was a senior member of the faculty, and he was, in essence, sort of the acting president. It must have been 2 years without a president before we got E.T. Jeffers. His name was Eliakim Tupper Jeffers, and I can understand why he went by E.T. He was a good one.
What was the student relationship, student-faculty administration relationship like in those early days?
In the first place, there was no administration separate from the faculty. And that continued on down. There was no administration per se when I was in college from 1928 to 1932. Administration is a fairly new development. At the time I was in college, we had a president teacher who devoted most of his time to administration, but he taught regularly, at least 1 or 2 courses. We had an academic dean professor who devoted most of his time to teaching, and he was Dr. Freeman, for whom the Freeman Science Hall is named. A really wonderful man, a wonderful professor. While he was serving as dean, he was also chairman of the chemistry department and teaching chemistry courses. We had a registrar teacher who devoted most of his time to teaching, and that was the administration. They were all bona fide members of the faculty, really. Now, much of the routine work was handled by several secretaries who were supervised by these men. Now, most of the work of the academic dean and the registrar were done by secretaries. So, administration as a separate, and of course, the administration thing has just burgeoned, and questions are being raised, and suggestions are being made. Should there be some relationship between the size of the administration and the size of the college, and so on? But to go back to your question, back in those early days, there was no separation between administration and faculty. As far as the relationship between the faculty and the students is concerned, the indications that I get from the very earliest student publications is that there was considerably more formality between student and teacher. Well, considerably more formality between student and student than there was at a later time. But underneath the formality, I think that there was a warm relationship, and the students, I can remember some of the old grads who went to school with some of those fairly early teachers, and they thought they were just wonderful. I've read the things that they have written about the teachers. So I think as far as the relationship between the students and the teachers are concerned, there was one of the advantages of the small college, and of course it wasn't quite a small college at that time, was that close relationship between the teacher and the student. And that's still one of the big pluses for the small college.
Can you tell us a little bit about the eating clubs that sprang up? I was reading in your book about eating clubs, and then there was some sort of sub rosa fraternity system or secret club situation going on that was brought up before the faculty.
When Westminster was founded, fraternities were springing up in some of the colleges around the country. And there were some of the Westminster men from the very beginning that were interested in organizing fraternities at Westminster. And the college was founded by the Associate Presbyterian Church that had a very strict rule against belonging to a secret society. And the Associate Presbyterian Church, as under that name, survived for only 6 years after the college was started, because it was united with the Associate Reformed Presbyterian Church to form the United Presbyterian Church, so that throughout most of its life, Westminster was a United Presbyterian College. But the United Presbyterian Church had this strict ban on belonging to secret societies. And there were some of the members of the church who probably belonged to the Masons, but kept it a secret that they were members of the Masons and so on. But so it was a strict policy at the college that there could not be any fraternities here. And this was a secret society which was strictly forbidden by the church, not to be countenanced here. There were 2 fraternities that were organized sub rosa, secretly, and of course secretly from the college faculty. I was about to say administration. From the college faculty. Now, I've never been able to figure out which came first, the eating club or the fraternities. Now, the eating clubs, the college provided no room or board for students. They had to find their own in town. And it was an obvious advantage to organize an eating club where they could eat better for cheaper, but with less outlay. So the eating club had an obvious financial advantage, but it also had the advantage of providing a front for the fraternities. And one of the fraternities was the Pyro Phi fraternity. Later became a TUO fraternity, and the TUOs and the Delts went together, and it became the SIGEPS. So SIGEPS has descended from this early fraternity. The other fraternity was Kappa Phi Lambda, and I think perhaps it came along about a year or 2 after the other. There's some difference of opinion about the starting dates, but it was part of a fraternity that had chapters on a couple of other colleges. So it was part of a national fraternity in a way. The Pyro Phi fraternity existed behind the front of the Kelly Club, I guess it was. The Kappa Phi Lambda fraternity existed behind the front of the Van Club. And my father and his brother were members of Kappa Phi Lambda, and back in the old days, it was, what do they call the pledges of the next generation? Legacies were taken very seriously. And when my brother and I came to college, of course, we were legacies of Kappa Phi Lambda, and we were expected to join there. I think it was actually somewhat of a disadvantage to us. My brother one time said that if he had no ties with Kappa Phi Lambda, he thought he would have joined the Crescent Club, which is now the Alpha Sig's. And I said, well, you know, if I had had no ties, family ties, I think I would have joined. The Crescent Club had become the Phi Pies by the time I was in college. Just a few years later, I would have joined that fraternity too. By the time my son went to college, legacies didn't mean beads, which of course was a good idea. And so he joined the Alpha Sig's, which was the fraternity my brother and I wanted to belong to. Both of my sons were Alpha Sig's then. My grandson was a Phi Tau. Well, anyway, there's a lot of personal history getting mixed in here, but
That's good.
yeah.
That's good. What did the students do as far as housing? You said that there were no, of course, dormitories on campus. They had to find their own housing. Evidently, there were people in town who provided housing.
That's right.
Did the college have any say as to who roomed together, or whether males and females shared a boarding house?
In the very early days, as far as I know, this was strictly between the students and the townspeople that found them. Now, the college started on very short notice with a short spring term, and there were probably not more than a couple dozen students. Now, when fall came, there were at least, well, my great-grandfather and the two professors, and I think two other ministers, were out selling scholarships. For $100, you could buy a perpetual scholarship, which means that any of your children or your grandchildren or your great-grandchildren would come to college tuition free. And it was a way that other colleges were using to raise ready money, and also it was a good recruiting device. Well, anyway, they sold a lot of scholarships, and the next fall, the college was flooded. They had over 200 students, about 200 students, and they never expected that many. And the townspeople were looking forward to providing room and board for the students, and of course it was an extra means of income for them. And but they were not anticipating this much either, and so it became sort of a job to find room and board for everybody. But I think townspeople sort of rallied to the cause, and farmers from surrounding areas took students in and so on. But you know, I had mentioned before that the college was understanding what was going on at other colleges. I am still just hard for me to conceive of the lack of segregation and discrimination that took place at the beginning of Westminster. I think it's phenomenal, really. There were no strict restrictions as far as housing is concerned, and there were men students and women students living in the same house. Co-ed housing, you know, we had it from the beginning. Now, I have a notion, I'm not sure about this, but I think some of the parents were a little bit worried about this situation. At any rate, the board did pass a resolution, and this was after a couple of years of co-ed housing, that men and women could not live in the same house if they were not related to each other. And my great-grandfather, who was on the board of the trustees and the financial agent for the college, was given the job of making this known to the faculty and students. Now, the next fall, when after school started, there was a student demonstration in which my poor great-grandfather was burned in effigy. And I don't know this for sure, but the only reason I can figure out is that the students did not like the regulation prohibiting co-ed housing, and they blamed it on the board and took it out on William Dickey.
And he was only the messenger.
I think pretty much. Now, I've never, the timing, is such, and I have not heard about anything else that the students would have got exercised about. There's a number of things in the early history of the college that the question in the historian's mind, the question in my mind is, why did this happen? Why did this happen? And so on. And sometimes you can find satisfactory answers. Sometimes you can find half answers, suppositions, possibilities, maybe probabilities. But sometimes you just end up with a blank. That's a mystery, unsolved.
What do you think Patterson's major contributions were?
Just making the college survive. The early years or critical period, well, in the human race, the early infancy is the critical period. We know how to take care of infants better now than we used to. But survival was a big issue, especially if they started with very limited financial resources, as a lot of these colleges did. Survival. He's the man that I'm sure contributed more than anybody else to the survival of the college. Then he had these things that he could contend with. The money worries is a big thing, and a lot of the other college presidents probably had the same kind of money worries. The fire was it was a hard blow, harder to understand. I mean, in our, we would not think it was that much serious a blow. It was not that serious a blow in 1927 when it happened again, and the Civil War was disruptive. There was a Westminster Guard organized among the students, which was called to service on a temporary basis a time or two. But then they would come back and take up their studies again, so that actually the Civil War did not did not involve a heavy withdrawal of men students from the campus, as was the case in World War I, and even more so, I think, in World War II.
I think we're going to cut it tonight. It's been over an hour, so it's gone so quickly, hasn't it?
We didn't cover a whole lot either, did we?
Well, but we got some marvelous stuff.
We got a lot of this. We got a lot of the stuff on my back.
We got
I've got another 15 minutes on the tape, but if you want to elaborate, that's fine.
I wouldn't mind going 15 more.
You want to?
If you want to.
Okay, well, let's do it.
The tape's still rolling, go ahead.
Okay. Well, I think we've gotten some marvelous stuff.
I think so too.
Whoa.
Need some more water?
No, it's all right. It's picking up okay, is it?
Yes.
My voice
Very
is
well.
not very strong.
Yes.
One thing that is sort of failing me a little bit as age comes on is my voice. I used to have a pretty robust voice, and I was even a good singer.
Yeah.
It's been quite a while since I've done any singing.
Yeah, you sound fine.
Well, your memory sure hasn't failed you.
That's for
It's
sure.
amazing stories.
Well, let's go for another 15
Okay.
minutes. You can
You
stop
know
us when the tape's
the
off.
tape
Yeah.
runs out.
All right.
Okay.
Okay, just signal us. But, so he was responsible for, where did the money come from? Where did they look for money? We didn't have alums at that point in time. There wasn't the Alumni Association to fall back on. Where did they look for funding?
Well, the first place they looked for money, I explained to you, was in selling these
Right.
scholarships. And I'm sure that it was not very long before they started after the alumni. The first alumni meeting that I had any record of, a committee of the alumni appeared at the Board of Trustee meeting and asked for time the evening before commencement for alumni exercises. And I think at that time we probably would have not had more than 6 or 8 graduating classes. And of course the classes would not have been 15 to 25 members, something like that. So it was a small alumni group, but they wanted to get together. And I'm sure that once alumni activity started, alumni contributions were sought, and where probably the alumni did contribute. Then I know that church support. There was 2 avenues. One was wealthy members of the supporting denomination were asked to contribute, and they were able to contribute in larger sums, you know. And congregations were asked to contribute. We had my memory doesn't always bring up the exact dates, and I guess I won't. The date's not important enough for me to look it up in the history. But we got, and I think this would have been around the 1880s. Excuse me, around the 1880s. We got a man to come in who was working especially with trying to develop financial support from the churches, and he succeeded in getting a lot of congregations to make a 5-year pledge. Every year for 5 years, we will give a certain amount to the college. His name escapes me at the moment, but this was a significant thing in the financial picture of the college. We didn't have what you would call an organized campaign, I don't think, until the time of the semi-centennial, when the college was 50 years old. And I know we had a committee, and a solicitation of alumni was organized. President Ferguson was working down in Pittsburgh and perhaps elsewhere on soliciting funds for that and so on. Now, I don't think that it, I don't have a record of exactly how much was raised, but I don't think it was a significant sum. I don't feel that the campaign was what we would consider successful now. So that the first well-organized, successful campaign came around 1910 when President Russell conducted what he called an endowment campaign. He got a foundation in New York to provide $200,000 if the college would raise $200,000 to match it within, I guess, 2 years. And that was successful. And we had $400,000, and for the first time in Westminster's history, and it was about 60 years old by that time, the college was on a fairly firm financial basis. $400,000 was a lot of money back in those days. You know, you compare it to college tuition of $50 or $60, something like that, $50, $60 a year. And see what the college tuition is now, then look at $400,000 and what it might be worth now. That was big money back in those days.
What was the first tuition? I think I read $8.50 a year.
A term.
A
It was
term.
about $25
per
a
term.
year. That's right. Yeah.
And room and board was $1.50 per
Something
week,
like,
something like that
that's
per
right.
week.
That was per week.
Yeah.
But the colleges back in those days were a little more like Mark Hopkins sitting on a log and a student on the other end. In other words, we didn't have to go in for all these frills. We have an awful lot of frills now, and they keep multiplying, you know. I walked past that fleet of 5 sleek white Oldsmobile sedans.
And the vans.
And the vans and everything. And I think back, when I was in college, the first time a college owned a car of any kind was when Dr. Orr's administration and Sam Fulton donated a station wagon for the use of the gospel teams to go out and visit churches. And of course, you know, we're talking about the 1950s now.
Well, and computers are so expensive too.
Yeah, we have all kinds of frills. It's a matter of keeping up with the Joneses.
Right.
And
To
you know,
compete
the way
with
it
other
is now,
colleges.
there are very few. One reason why there are so few liberal arts colleges is because in order to attract students, the liberal arts colleges are going more vocational, and in order to keep up with the other colleges that are going vocational, you know, I have had heart-to-heart talks and memos with Dr. Remick about this. Dr. Remick is closer to the situation than I am, and he feels like we have to go with the flow.
Speaking of the curriculum, I'm sure the curriculum has changed a lot over all of these years. I mean, we started out with the classics, and today it's sort of branched off in a lot of different areas. But we've still managed to maintain that liberal arts core that I think makes Westminster what it is. Would you agree with that?
Well, liberal arts has been redefined as a curriculum, has changed and developed. Back in the time the college started, the classical course, which was associated in people's minds with liberal arts, was, as I said before, over half ancient languages. Now, college curriculum underwent a real revolution during the last half of the 1800s. And while Westminster was way out in front in coeducation, I think they did a pretty good job of keeping pace with the changes. They may not have been on the very cutting edge, but they were changing with the times. And President Jeffers was a key man on this. He was a key man on the developing, bringing the college into the what was happening to the classical curriculum and what was developing from it. He brought in modern languages and American literature, English literature. Before that time, it was all classical literature. There was no American literature, English literature, and so on. By the time of and then a little later in the 1800s, the natural sciences, which had been textbook courses originally, had developed into laboratory courses, and modern science was part of the curriculum. And you had, by the turn of the century, the curriculum had very little resemblance to the original curriculum. Now the changes, of course there's been changes since then, but not as dramatic. It was such a sweeping change in curriculum. I wrote a graduate term paper on that. The Westminster's curriculum revolution during that. I've got a lot of Westminster history in the archives. It's not in these books too. I've written on a number of different subjects.
Well, I guess the curriculum is an ongoing thing. I mean, today
Yes.
we're still trying to revise
Yes.
the liberal studies curriculum.
According to, there was a friend of Dr. Remick's. He had been a college president out in the Midwest, who was writing a book on liberal arts colleges. And he started out with the assumption that there were over 600 liberal arts colleges in the country. But as he set up some criteria, which I think seemed rather generous to me. One of them was that over half of the graduates, no. It was at least 40% of the graduates should graduate in liberal arts studies, and not more than 60% should be in vocational studies. And he found that there were only about half of the, there was only about, I don't remember the exact number, I think it may have been 200 and some that met his qualification for liberal arts, which really shook him up. And I had to get out the last commencement program and check, and we just missed the cut. We had a little over 60% in vocational programs and a little less than 40% in liberal arts programs. And of course it's hard to draw the line, but economics would be liberal arts. The accounting and other things in business administration would be vocational courses. One thing we still do have, which I think is extremely important, is that students are still required to take a number of courses, a fairly broad spectrum of courses outside of their major field, which means that now it sort of shakes me up a little bit to realize that a student can graduate from Westminster with an AB degree without ever having taken a single course in history or a single course in American or English literature. Those things used to be considered keystones of liberal arts. But
employers today, I think, are looking for people, at least this has been my experience, they're looking for people with a liberal arts background and some kind of technical degree.
Yes.
I've been told that if a student can combine the two,
Yes.
an employer will send a limo to their door. They're
Yeah.
desperate for people
Yes.
who have liberal arts grounding.
Yes. There's. I found as I was in the course of my work in administration, I would find myself sometimes sitting in the offices of industrial executives and so on, and they. I ran into the idea rather frequently that for certain jobs, particularly in personnel and public relations and so on, they would rather have somebody with liberal arts background. One of them said, a guy can be a great engineer and a very poor administrator.